Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Today I'm going to continue telling you about the adventures and poetry of Egill Skalla-Grímsson. Now in our last installment we covered everything from Egill's first skaldic poem at the age of 3 to the party at which, having been lied to and told there was no beer, he drank all the beer and then killed his lying host. Now this murder of Bordr, a friend of Queen Gunhildr, puts his family potentially back in jeopardy with the Norwegian kings, who they have struggled not to re-enter into conflict with. As I mentioned in the last video, his father Skallagrímr and grandfather Kveldulfr had a bad history with the Norwegian kings. But Thorir, friend to Egill's father Skallagrímr and now to his children Egill and Thorolfr, negotiates with King Eirikr Bloodaxe to repay him for the lost men, as they had pursued Egill as well, and he had killed some of the pursuers. And although Eirikr, the king, is quite furious, he does accept the settlement. Now the next summer, Thorolfr and Egill, the two brothers, are going to go raiding in the Baltic, in what Old Norse calls Kurland, which seems to be the shores of Latvia and Lithuania. By some mischance, they get captured by one of these Baltic farmers and imprisoned in a house. But Egill manages to chew through the ropes that bind him. Then he frees his companions, Thorolfr and some other Vikings they're with. And then they find another Norseman, a Dane named Aki, who's been kept captive at this house. And he says that he was captured while he and his sons were trying to raid these Balts themselves, and as they're getting out, they realize they're in a barn. They're not in the main house, and that in the main house the Balts are partying about how they are, how they've captured these Vikings. Well, Egill finds out from Aki where the Balts keep their treasure, and there's quite a bit, including a fantastic sword named Nadra, and so the Vikings get out under cover of night with the Balts all partying in their house. They get out with a bunch of treasure, and Egill gets a cool sword out of the deal. But as they're running away through the forest, Egill has a sudden attack of conscience. He puts down the treasure that he's carrying and he says, we robbed these people and they don't even know our names. So he runs back, barricades the Balts inside their house, sets the house on fire, and then calls out to them who it is who has done this. So taking credit for it, which of course is the Norse Dranger thing to do. You want to have your name associated with your deeds. And since violence per se is not bad, especially if it's not done against your own family, he can take credit for this. And his conscience assuaged. So not too long after this, they find themselves in Denmark, attending a feast thrown by a local leader. And straws are drawn to determine who will sit next to who, and Egill ends up sitting next to a young woman who is really not very interested in Egill. She's #unimpressed at this young kid. I think he's barely a teenager at this point. She says, "You haven't ever killed anybody, who are you?" And in fact, she says it in a poem. This is another one of my translations of a poem from Egill Saga from chapter 48. She says, "What skal tu svein I sesmin, thvit thu sjaldan hefur gefnar, vargi varmar bróðir, vessa vilk ein of mina, sot hadu hravn I hausti, og fræsoli gjalla, vasta þú atthars eggjar og skelþunnar runusk." What do you want, kid, in my seat? You haven't often given wolves a warm corpse breakfast. I'd rather keep myself company. You didn't see ravens this fall calling over fallen men. You weren't there, where blades chipped one another in flight. But Egill pulls her in close and responds with his own poem. Farit hefk blóðgum brandi, svot mer benþiður fylgði, og gjallanda geri, gangar vas harður af vikingum, gerðum reiðir róstu, rann eldur of sjótmanna, letum blóðga búka, I borklíðum sævask. I've traveled with a bloody blade, so bloody the ravens followed, and my spear sang loud. It was a hard rush of Vikings. In our rage we made battle our fires destroyed men's homes. I let bloody bodies rest by the city gates. So they end up having a happy night's drinking together. Now back in Norway, there is a new invitation to a party that is either hosted by or predominantly featuring Queen Gunhildr. And she does have Thorir as well as Thorolfr and Egill invited, and she is definitely planning to kill Thorolfr and Egill. Egill has the good sense not to go, but Thorolfr goes, and although the queen's assassin doesn't manage to kill Thorolfr himself, he does kill one of Thorolfr's men in the pretense that he had cheated at a drinking game. Norse parties, right? Not too different perhaps from parties some people are familiar with today. So Thorolfr, even though the next summer Thorolfr and Egill track this guy down and kill him, he's fled to Denmark because he's hypothetically an outlaw because he killed someone during a holiday. But the king and queen have helped him get away to Denmark. Thorolfr and Egill go after him. Excuse me, they don't manage to kill him. They kill some of his guys, but he gets away. They realize that things are going to be too hot for them back in Norway, so they need to spend their time somewhere else for a while. And so Thorolfr and Egill find themselves in England, where they take service with King Athelstan of England. Now, in England, Egill and Thorolfr are quote-unquote prime-signed. This is not baptism, it is merely the making of a cross by Christian clergy over someone who has not been baptized yet, and it's supposed to expel any sort of evil spirits that a pagan might have in them so they can do business with and ally with Christians. So Egill and Thorolfr are prime-signed to join the army of the Christian king Athelstan, and they find themselves engaged in Athelstan's great campaign against a certain King Olav of the Scots. Now there are several days of hard fighting, and on the second morning of the battle, when they wake up, Athelstan assigns Egill to lead a forward group of men into the Scots on a very dangerous mission that is very likely to get some people killed of their own side. Thorolfr, however, volunteers to take the lead of this expedition himself instead, and although Egill predicts this will lead to disaster, Thorolfr ends up doing it. Now, we have a really kind of cinematic moment here as we hear of Thorolfr going way out ahead of his men, fighting, but then Egill happens to see not Thorolfr himself dying, but his flag bearer retreating, and Egill knows his brother would never retreat. So Egill knows that Thorolfr has died, and he goes berserker, I guess in the most literal way, killing Scots left and right. And finally, after the battle is over, with Athelstan having won a victory, we have one of the most, I think, pointedly emotional poems from any Norse saga. When Egill says over Thorolfr's grave, Jord grør en ver verdum, vinu nær of minum, helnáð estat hylja harm ogatum barma. The earth will grow back over my excellent brother at Vina, and I must bury my sorrow, which is a hellish pain. Note the interesting and artistic use of language about burial to talk about his emotional state. He has to bury his sorrow, hylja, the same thing you do when you bury someone in a mound, and he calls it a hellish pain. Hell, of course, being the realm of the dead, the underworld, which includes the grave itself. Now Egill is very upset at the death of his brother, and although Athelstan has a victory feast later, Egill spends his time at the victory feast looking very, very unhappy. He keeps popping one eyebrow up and down while he keeps drawing his sword in and out of his scabbard, until finally Athelstan seems to understand what he wants and awards him not only a ring from his own arm at the end of his own sword, but 2 large treasure chests of silver, which will become Egill's constant companions for the rest of the saga. He really treasures this treasure. Alright, well that's a very good breaking point actually for this story, so I will see you again on the next installment of the saga and life and poetry of Egill Skalla-Grímsson. For now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.